faculty and students filtering in a little bit late. They're teaching, so just going to wait another minute. Impatient auditors here. Here they are. What time you got here? Now we can start. just kidding. Okay, I'm gonna start our introductions. There will be other people coming and filtering in, so please indulge them, and maybe if you could, maybe move towards the center if there are empty seats next to you. Welcome to this public lecture sponsored by the Hamilton Center for Classical and Civic Education here at the University of Florida. My name is Jeffrey Collins. I'm a professor at the Hamilton Center, and I've been asked to do this introduction in part because the speaker tonight is in my field, but also because I've known him for several decades. So I met Steve Pincus about 20 years ago, maybe even more than that, alas, when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago. Steve Pincus was a professor of history at the University of Chicago at the time. He had just finished his PhD at Harvard a few years earlier. He subsequently became a chair of history at Yale University, and then he has now returned to the University of Chicago as the Thomas Donnelly Professor of British History at the University of Chicago. So he's ping-ponged between two of our finest higher educational institutions. He is an incredibly well-published expert on European history, British history, and the British Empire, a specialist on the 17th and 18th centuries. I'd stand here forever describing his articles and books to you. He's edited several books. He's written many single-authored books. I'll just mention a couple of them to give you a sense of the range of his scholarship. Probably his most famous book, 2006, I believe, 1688, The First Modern Revolution, a major reinterpretation of what used to be called the Glorious Revolution, a synthetic, huge archival book which has been controversial, provocative, widely praised, widely debated, reinterpreting the Revolution of 1688 as the foundations, really, of the modern liberal order. Major book. He has written on a smaller book, which might be of interest to some of you students, called The Heart of the Declaration, which is a kind of intellectual history of the Declaration of Independence, reinterpreting it as a comment on the British Empire. That gives you some sense of the range of his work. He's currently working on a major study, and it's going to be monumental, I think, in all respects, of the British Empire, reinterpretation of the British Empire, a global history of the British Empire from about 1650 until the late 18th century. And that is the sort of research that we're going to be getting a glimpse of today. Steve Pincus is an important historian, an archival historian, a productive historian, a provocative and argumentative historian, and it is my great pleasure to introduce him to you today. So please join me in welcoming Steve Pincus to speak on Thinking the British Empire Whole.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff, for such a kind introduction. I always thought of myself as an Irenic historian, but maybe not. So, as Jeff said, this is coming out of this book, which I'm finishing, on the global British Empire, which really runs from the middle of the 17th century, as Jeff said, until the founding of New South Wales at the end of Australia, at the end of the 18th century. This talk comes from, is one of the two methodological chapters, which sort of tells you how I'm thinking about constructing or thinking about the British Empire. And so I guess I'll just jump right into it. The British Empire already by the middle of the 18th century was global. It is not the case, obviously, that the entire map of the world is colored red, but there are bits of the world colored all over the world, colored red already by 1763. the problem that makes it difficult to write about the British Empire, I think, is that most of the scholarship written about the British Empire, much of it is of very high quality, tends to only look at part of the British Empire. And it only looks at part of the British Empire because, in fact, the agenda of most historians is try to explain the origins of one nation state or another. So there's early American history and the British Empire, which is about trying to understand the origins of the United States. There's the history of Jamaica in the British Empire, which is interesting, but obviously thinking about the modern nation state of Jamaica. The history of Canada, which was, is still, in some sense, part of the British Empire. The history of the British Empire in India, which tends to focus on the contours of the modern state of India rather than British South Asia, exactly, which tells you where the historiography is going. And my contention is that understanding these in proto-national terms, or trying to understand at best a binary relationship between one area of the world and Britain, misses the fact that actually this was a global empire, and people at the time, and one of the claims I'm going to try to convince you of, people at the time, both people being colonized and the colonizers, thought about it as a global phenomenon. So I think there's several advantages for thinking the British Empire whole. And I must say, I keep these slides. I realize they're incredibly sort of tacky and small. It just, as my wife frequently tells me, it's what makes my slide presentations me, right? So I'm sorry about that. So first of all, and I'm going to just sort of read these off, right? So it's important for imperial actors, because when imperial agents made decisions about deploying resources, whether for building roads or calling in naval support, they were constrained by what was going on elsewhere in the empire. Politicians shaped their imperial decisions by thinking through how they understand the empire in its entirety. So failure to take account of resource constraints or global perceptions of the nature of the empire necessarily provides a partial view. And just to give you a sense, I'm arguing in one of the later chapters that the Americans won the American Revolution precisely because the British Army and Navy had to deploy the Army in South Asia and the Navy in the West Indies. If that hadn't happened, I think the American Revolution would have been somewhat less successful despite all the good ideas. Second, it's important from the perspective of colonists and settlers. A fisherman in New England, a weaver in Bengal, a sugar planter in Jamaica all responded to demands placed upon them in the context of what they understood to be a structurally linked global empire and the strategies of imperial actors. If a particular bounty or tax had a known effect in Scotland, West Indians could reason analogically about what the effect was going to be about them, and they knew about them from a global press. If a set of policies imposed in North America benefited a particular interest group in England, Americans could evaluate what the consequences were of supporting that interest. So failure to think the empire whole thus makes it difficult to access the behavior of those reacting to or resisting imperial demands or provisions. So in other words, the fact that the colonized knew what the constraints were informed their actions. Third, it's important for indigenous history. And here I just want to take seriously the arguments of indigenous historians and apply them and take seriously, because I think indigenous historians are absolutely right that one needs to take indigenous agency seriously. But I think by a corollary of that is if one needs to take indigenous agency seriously, then one needs to also take the agency of imperial actors seriously and take them both seriously as interactions. And I think one of the problems with the honorable exception of Aboriginal history, which is the one form of indigenous historiography which does that seriously, is that we tend to take and assume the actions of the imperialists as always extractive, always doing certain sets of things, rather than understanding the interactions. So the ways that one should take indigenous agency seriously, one needs to take the agency of the imperial actor seriously, and to undertake and to therefore evaluate the interactions as not overdetermined, but as contingently related to both these sets of agencies. Fourth, I guess I took out fourth for this talk. First, I'm just going to talk about, this is just sort of an outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about the 17th and 18th century global vision, then talk about what I mean by an empire. Third, I'm going to insist that the British Empire was a state to develop strong institutions and infrastructures, and that's central to my concern, is that one has to take the stateness of the empire seriously. Fourth, I'm going to talk about partisan divisions about how best to govern the empire. Fifth, I'm going to talk about an alternative global vision which has been advocated in the historiography recently, and I'm going to talk about the virtues and the non-virtues of such a vision. And then I'm going to conclude with what I see as the payoff of thinking the empire whole. So global vision. From the 1730s, the emergence, an English press, newspaper press emerged in the 17th century, but by the second and third decades of the 18th century, there were newspapers, particularly these two newspapers, that were bestsellers across the British Empire. And here I'm talking about the journal Common Sense, the title of which Tom Paine cribbed for the title of his, I mean, he was consciously referring to this journal when he wrote his famous pamphlet, Common Sense, and The Craftsman, which was sort of famously known as a kind of opposition journal. But both of these newspapers could be found in coffee houses in Kingston, Jamaica, I now know, in a Jewish reading room perhaps like this one, which exists on the streets of New York in the 1740s, but could also be found in Bombay, in Calcutta, in Madras or Chennai, across the British Empire. There were similar newspapers, local newspapers in the West Indies, like the Jamaican Courant and Barbados Mercury. These are just two of, I think, 48 different West Indian titles from the middle of the 18th century. And these newspapers provided not just local information, but imperial information. So one can learn in these West Indian newspapers of British ministerial attacks on freedom of speech in London and New York in the 1720s. One could hear worries about the fall of the oppressive ministry of George Grenville in 1765, and one could be alarmed in the 1780s by the advances of Hyder Ali and then Tipu Sultan and their French allies in India. This in a Jamaican newspaper, right? I mean, so the point is that people were concerned about what was going on not just in their locality but across the empire. This was true in British North America, and here I'll just take Ben Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, one issue of that, or 1 year of that. For example, so in the summer of 1765 in Pennsylvania, one could read about the Pennsylvania Gazette condemned opposition to the pro-commercial law, common law in Quebec, that was being implemented in Quebec. You learned of John Stuart's negotiations with the Creek in Georgia. They reported on tensions between Governor William Henry Littleton and the Jamaican Assembly, and tensions there were, detailed rumors of Patriot attempts to topple George Grenville's ministry in London, extensive information on the Spitalfield riots, sort of labor protest in London in 1765. There were local accounts of white boy agitation in Munster and Ireland, and one could also read the triumphant narrative of the Battle of Buxar, the defeat of the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II by Hector Munro, leading to the granting of the Diwani and the development of British rule in South Asia. In Hickey's General Gazette, Bengal Gazette, published in Calcutta, one could read from James Augustus Hickey, who was himself an Irish patriot who apprenticed to a Scottish printer in London before moving to Calcutta. He reported on the struggle for control of the Caribbean in the American Revolutionary War. He indicated deep discontent in Jamaica about actions of the imperial governor, drawing parallels with Warren Hastings in Bengal. And he commented that Ireland is soon going to play the same game as America in the midst of the revolution. So all of this one would read on the streets of Calcutta. So there was this really kind of global vision. So what are the implications? Well, the implications are first, that the inhabitants of the British provinces had a global, not a localist outlook. And that I'm going to insist upon. Second, home for these people was not England, but the empire. And that's frequently, I think, been mistaken in literature. Home is always assumed to be a reference to England, but home is actually taken to be the empire. So the information they sought was not just about from where the settlers came, but also the empire as a whole. And this was true, it turns out, we now know, for the ways in which Maroons in Jamaica, the Haudenosaunee in North America, and Bombay Hindu, Muslim, and Parsi merchants, how they read and learned a great deal about the empire and wrote about and commented on the empire as a whole. So this sort of global phenomenon was not just a perception of imperial administrators, not just a perception of colonists or settlers, but including all of the subjects or the majority of subjects in the British Empire. So, okay, lots of talk about empire. What is an empire? Now, this is actually a complicated question. It's a complicated question because most people who talk about empire either write about empire as a term of nostalgia, right? The great things, what we have lost, or with moral contempt, right? So it's not an analytical category, it's an emotive term. Empire is either a bad thing or a good thing, not a thing to be analyzed and defined. Now, recently, there's been a lot of revival of interest in empire, which has been more conceptually sophisticated. And here I take an example of two books that are, have sold relatively well. Frederick Cooper and Jane Burbank's Empires, A World History, and Tony Hopkins' American Empire. Now, the American Empire, you might think it's just about the US, but actually the first, I don't know, what is it, 75, 100,000 words are about the British Empire and about empires more generally. So why has there been a revival of interest in empire? I think one is a set of discontents with the nation state, discontents which I think politically can be located on both the left and the right. I mean, that is to say, I don't think it's something which is ideologically specific. So the sociologist Krishan Kumar has said that many people are no longer convinced the nation state is the best or only form with which to confront the future. So people have pointed to sub-state terrorism, multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, the European Union. All of these suggest other forms of organization other than the nation state, which has led people, I think, in some degree, to think about empires. So what is an empire? Empires, I want to be specific, have two characteristics. First, they're multi-ethnic, as opposed to nation states. That is to say, the ideal of the nation state, not the reality, the social reality of the nation state, but the ideal of the nation state is a notion of homogeneity, right? The idea is that we're all Americans, or they're all French, or they're all Jamaicans, or whatever. That's the idea of the nation state. But empire is based on an ideal of heterogeneity, of difference, different ethnicities, different religions, different cultures. As Charlie Mayer said, the empire is differentiated religiously, nationally, occupationally, and territorially. Second, empires are states. They have infrastructures and institutions. As the sociologist Karen Barkey put it, empires at the height of their power were strong states, but empires at all times, height of their power, nadir of their power, they're always states. So empire is neutral with respect to political form. Empires are simply multi-ethnic states. So like the vast majority of states in human history, most empires were repressive and a minority of them were inclusive, like the vast majority of states in human history, right? Like any state, they can be democratic or autocratic. Empires are just multi-ethnic states. Empires have repertoires. They have different strategies of rule, as Burbank and Cooper said. Tony Hopkins said that they could be predatory or developmental. But I disagree with Hopkins to some degree. I like the distinction, but I think his history isn't bad, which isn't very good, which is a hard thing to say, I guess, about a historian. But it says, so Hopkins, who sees early empires as predatory, and only after the 19th century can empires become developmental. Hint, hint, Tony was a 19th and 20th century historian, so the period before he studied was obviously simplistic. But I see these two models actually in conflict in the British Empire in the period long before 1784, that we see real conflict beforehand. But whereas for a developmental state for Tony Hopkins implied states that merely defended the contours of free trade, I take developmental states in a broader sense to be states which had repertoires that focused on infrastructural development for whatever reason. Okay, what about the British imperial state? Well, the standard view is that the British Empire had a weak state. So Neil Ferguson, who now teaches at Stanford, says that the British Empire was the nearest thing there has ever been to a world government, yet its mode of operation was a triumph of minimalism. The British government was designed to privatize overseas expansion. Jeremy Black, in several of his 120 books, have said, maybe it's 122 by now, but you would never know. By the end of the lecture, it'll be 123. In any event, the limited authority and power of government within Britain greatly affected the character of British imperialism. This meant that the commercial focus, or at least nexus of much British imperial activity, was such that the role of the state was less than that of the Portuguese, Spanish, and French. Actually, against these great historians, I suggest that the British imperial state was quite strong. So long ago, John Brewer showed that the strength of the British state in Europe was remarkable over the course of the long 18th century, that it developed a very powerful infrastructural state with great power to do infrastructure in Europe. But in fact, I mean, my own analysis has suggested that Britain actually devoted far more resources to colonial development than the French and the Spanish empires. And one way of measuring this is that in Spain, Russia, the Holy Roman Empire in the 17th and 18th century, they spent over 90% of their revenues on warfare, on fighting wars. Which leaves 10% for other things, right? France and the Dutch Republic, absolutist France and the Dutch Republic, and here I want to point out that this doesn't have to do with governmental form, spent about 80% on warfare. But Britain spent about 65% on warfare. That leaves a fairly large increment to spend on other things compared to their rivals. So what did Britain spend their money on? Well, they mostly spent the money on the empire, on development in the colonies, Scotland and Ireland. And I mean, I'm not taking the position here, but I will take the position, if you want to ask me about it, that Scotland and Ireland should be thought of as colonies for most of the period. So there was very little direct spending in England. So spending in England went through traditional mechanisms. So for example, the Turnpike Acts are the great example, right? So to build roads in England, Parliament passed an act which says you can have right of way to build the roads. You, locality, you get the money to build the roads, right? So they don't fund the roads, they just create an enabling act. In fact, throughout the empire, they spent a lot of money on things. They spent money on salaries of officials in the West Indies, settling immigrant communities in the various colonies from Bombay to Halifax. They established the colonies of Georgia, Florida, Nova Scotia, and Canada by providing them with startup costs, developing infrastructure in New York, New England, Nova Scotia, Bombay, and Tangier. And I'm told in New Jersey, although judging by modern-day New Jersey, I don't think it had much of an effect, developing educational institutions in Dublin, Cambridge, Williamsburg, Kingston, Charleston, Aberdeen, and Glasgow, also some in New Haven as well. They also rebuilt Charleston, South Carolina after the fire of 1740 burnt it to the ground, and they provided hurricane relief in 1781. And the remarkable thing is that hurricanes don't recognize national boundaries, right? So the hurricane attacks wherever it attacks, right? So it attacked equally the British Caribbean, the French Caribbean, and the Spanish Caribbean. So after the hurricane of 1781 wreaked huge amounts of devastation throughout the Caribbean, the Spanish said, too bad. The French said, okay, 1.5 years of tax relief. Okay, that's some form of tax relief. The British spent £50 million on rebuilding places destroyed in the Caribbean. Finally, they built commercial roads in Scotland and roads into the interior in South Asia. So they moved away from the coasts. I don't know why I left these pictures of Charleston, South Carolina, but this is a very nice painting of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Okay, they also, we tend to underestimate the amount of money spent by the British Empire just by analyzing the treasury books, and this is sort of a in-the-weeds point, but I think it's an important one. The British government gave bounties to give encouragement for development of certain products. But these bounties were skimmed off the top of customs receipts and excise receipts, so they never actually went in the treasury. So in the official books, they're not counted as official expenditures, but they were official expenditures, right? So in other words, if you look at the treasury receipts for a particular year, there's no money sent out in bounties because it's the bounties they've declared for developing various products in various colonies, which went to develop these products in the various colonies. But it never went into the treasury, so it doesn't actually count as an expenditure. So we have huge amounts of money being given out in bounties that we just can't quantify. I guess I'm going to say something about this mid-century transformation in North America. In the early 1750s, it took information from the American interior about 1 to 2 months longer to reach London than it did from the northern Canadian interior to reach Paris, right? So it was much slower, which indicates something about the state of infrastructure, roads, et cetera, in those places. But by the late 1750s, the situation was more than reversed. Why had this pattern shifted? Well, it has to do with the huge British state involvement in constructing infrastructure. Right? So from loosely connected, and this is what Alec Reichart said in his Yale doctoral dissertation, from loosely connected provincially oriented communication networks transformed to a robust, increasingly centralized British imperial communications infrastructure. What did they do? So the plans came from colonials like Benjamin Franklin and imperial agents like Brigadier General John Forbes, who, in case you hadn't figured it out, was Scottish, for the creation of a New York Falmouth packet boat, bateau services on North American rivers, establishing offices of the Ordnance, Quartermaster General, Royal Engineers, the Commissary, professionalization of the bureaucracy, all following developments that had begun in Scotland in the wake of the 45 Rebellion. So again, the colony of Scotland ends up being a sort of laboratory for these American imperial experiments. And communication shifted then from private ad hoc mechanisms to professionalized state-sponsored ones to get stuff, information and goods from one place to another. It involves centralization. So before the 7 Years' War, before 1757, communication, that is to say, goods, letters, etc., moved from colonial capitals like Williamsburg, Charleston, Philadelphia, outwards, right? But after this, during the war, centralization based on the New York-Albany axis meant that communication spread out, spoke-like from this center. So it's actually the British Empire which made New York into the commercial center it is today, right? Up until that time, it was one among many capitals, one among many communication networks. It was what the infrastructure of the British, infrastructural commitments of the British Empire which changed things. So the implications were significant. In the short term, Britain gained a decisive advantage over the French, who didn't spend on imperial infrastructure at all during the war, and the result was that the British won the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, or Nova Scotian War, as I think it should be called, whatever you want to call that period between 1757 and 1763. Infrastructure made the huge difference. Britain gained an advantage. Second, in the medium term, it created a new web of roads, canals, and routes extending into the American interior, which then transformed the indigenous reality. So there were new post-war infrastructures and institutions, the creation of the northern and southern superintendents of Indian affairs, and here's one of them, and John Stewart, the other, was camera shy, so I just give you his house in Charleston. But most importantly, this infrastructure limited Indian north-south connections, right? So first, they sought to monitor and prevent messages moving north to south among indigenous peoples. Second, they required passports of Indians and mandated use of specific pathways. They built roads to cut across Indian north-south pathways, and they used treaties to extend the western boundary so as to cut off Indian paths. And here's a map which shows this, what this is. So the white roads are the British roads, and you can see the indigenous paths that are just cut off by these things. And so you're making it much harder for indigenous people to get information north and south. So the British Empire depended on infrastructure. For comparative advantage versus imperial rivals, it transformed the experience of various indigenous peoples in both North America and India. One could tell the same kind of story for what happened in South Asia in the middle and third quarter of the 18th century. And they set terms of negotiations. So the balance, by building up infrastructure, the balance of negotiating power radically shifted. Now, it's become fashionable to talk about empires as negotiations. Well, that's right, but the imperial interactions were negotiations in much the same way that if I come up to Carl with a gun and say, Carl, will you hand me your wallet? It's a negotiation. He can choose not to give me his wallet, and I can choose to shoot him or not to shoot him. That's a negotiation, right? The point which I'm trying to make is that infrastructure, basically, the infrastructural development basically gave the British Empire a gun, right? And I think to talk about negotiated empire without taking infrastructure and administrative development seriously is to miss 95% of the story. I mean, there's still a negotiation, that's right, but it's imbalanced. So let me talk briefly about repertoires of empire. There was no consensus within the British Empire. There were Tory versus Whig divisions from the second half of the 17th century, which had to have Tories who sort of emphasized or prioritized gaining land, and land is the basis of property, whereas Whigs thought of labor as the basis of property. But from the 1720s and 1730s, new divisions of a political economy of empire emerged, which focused on divided the debate in the British Empire, not only in England, but across the empire, over those who wanted to focus on the importance of colonial consumption versus those who thought what was really important was the colonial production of things like tobacco, sugar, rice, gold, silver, etc. So there's Robert Walpole, Prime Minister of England between 1720 and 1742. He was a very large man, about 6'4", 350 pounds. So this picture sort of captures him. The key principles of Walpolean political economy was to emphasize colonial production, to privilege the sugar islands, the sugar that was produced in places like Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, etc., to emphasize the centrality of slavery to the production, chattel slavery is the production of these goods, and to argue that war was always bad for a trading nation. These arguments were enunciated in a series of pamphlets by William Wood, who played a significant role, and Joshua G. Again, Joshua G., a Quaker, was a bit camera shy, but this is his house. You can still visit in Hampstead, Fenton House, anytime you like. So they argued, I'm just going to sort of elaborate these arguments that they made. They argued that the sugar colonies were central because the colonies produced commodities indispensably necessary to the part of the world, to this part of the world. They may with industry and conduct be made if we do not suffer the French to encroach upon us or rival us, an inexhaustible mine of treasure to their mother country, right? A mine of treasure to you Latin Americans will know that there's clearly saying this is the equivalent of Potosi. Right? Jamaica was the most valuable plantation, Wood said, belonging to the crown. Slavery for him was the key. The labor of Negroes is the principal foundation of our riches from the plantations. That's what Wood said. The Quaker, right, I mean, just in case you've gotten the sense from recent Friends propaganda, the Quakers were always abolitionists. The Quaker said, our plantations are supported by the labor of slaves and are profit either more or less according to the numbers they are employed. Planting sugar and tobacco, the great causes of the increase of the riches of the kingdom, could not be supported without African slaves. That's what said, right? I mean, so there's this kind of slavery, pro-slavery argument because slavery is necessary to produce sugar. And they insisted that war was bad for a trading nation. So William Wood said, a war will have a terrible effect on the trading part of mankind, and particularly with us. Horace Walpole, who was Robert Walpole's younger brother, said that war is both a dangerous and a destructive expedient to any nation, especially a trading and industrious one. And now, the great man himself, we certainly ought not to have recourse to arms as long as there is any prospect of obtaining redress in a peaceable manner. Patriot political economy, in Common Sense and the Craftsman, took a rather different point of view. They argued that the key to British and imperial prosperity was exporting British manufactured goods from Britain to the colonies and beyond. So mostly textiles, but also metalwares made in places like Sheffield and Birmingham to the colonies. Slaves, they argued, made for bad consumers and inefficient producers. So their argument was that if you value consumption, slave societies made absolutely no sense. And they argued that France was a serious threat to British imperial prosperity. So for them, raw materials were absolutely secondary. Natural commodities, however valuable, are never of any great service to a country because they maintain no great number of subjects nor enrich many individuals, said the Patriot Mayor of London, Sir John Barnard. The gold and silver of the Spanish and Portuguese settlements of America are commodities of great value, he admitted. But as they are produced by the labor of slaves and enrich only the king and a few lords, they have rather diminished than increased the power and the riches of both those kingdoms. The problem with mineral extraction and the cultivation of sugar, tobacco, or rice is that they maintain no great number of industrious subjects in which the power of a country subsists. So it's a completely different notion of political economy. And colonies then were valuable for what they consumed much more than for what they produced. The principal benefits arising to Great Britain from the trade of the colonies, the first three items that Sir William Keith, the Patriot Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, said were their colonial consumption of woolen manufactures exported from Britain, their robust taste for British-produced linens and calicos. Linens, you'll recall, were being made mostly in Ireland and to some degree in Scotland, and their burgeoning desire for luxury items such as silks, haberdashery, household furniture, and trinkets of all sorts. They lamented the decline of trade. While trade in absolute terms was thriving, Britain had a net negative balance with all but the economies, and therefore exports were in decline, so they lamented the decline of British exports to Spanish America in particular during this period, right? So the argument was that only the colonies were keeping the British economy humming along. And they argued slavery was deleterious. So Barnard said he wished none of the plantations found it necessary to have any slaves. Georgia in the 1730s outlawed slavery because it was against the gospel and fundamental law of England, also because it led, according to Oglethorpe, to oligarchy, right? I mean, the argument is that slavery leads inevitably to oligarchy. William Byrd II of Virginia, who was one mean plantation owner, hoped that the British Parliament will put an end to this unchristian traffic of making merchandise of our fellow subjects. So the economic arguments were the key to this, not the moral arguments. And I think this is absolutely central to understanding the nature of later abolitionist argument. In the 1720s, 1730s, and 1740s, the argument against slavery was economic, much more than moral. And the argument was, it's not that they didn't know the moral argument, they just said the moral argument wasn't going to convince anybody. Wasn't going to convince anybody to change their practices. So their arguments were that slaves were not consumers, that no plantation owner would buy his slaves new suits of clothes all the time and would prevent them from doing that. Slavery, they said, created inevitably an oligarchical society, which in an oligarchical society, consumption was further suppressed. And they argued that slavery required expensive militarization because slave owners always treat slaves badly, and slaves inevitably are going to rebel, and that turns out to be really, really costly. So there was a partisan divide over empire. Establishment Whigs wanted a predatory model of empire, to use Tony Hopkins' terms, whereas the Patriots developed a developmental argument of empire. And this seems to be confirmed by two relatively recent books, one by Amy Watson. It's a book that's about to come out, like within a week, which shows that parties were institutionalized across the empire with her local studies of New York, Georgia, Jamaica, and Scotland along these lines, these political economic divisions. And James Vaughan's well-regarded Yale University Press book shows similar divisions over Bengal. Now, instead of giving you a case study, because it would take too much time, I'm just going to jump to talking a little bit about settler colonialism. Settler colonialism has been sort of all the rage in all sorts of departments recently. And to be fair, settler colonialism is mostly thrown around as a tagline rather than as an analytical category. But I want to take seriously those serious scholars who have made it into an analytical category, and then compare their approach with my approach, right? So first, they, like our approach, the settler colonials try to think transnationally and globally. So the original attraction was as a way of thinking settlers in North America, in Australia, maybe on the West Bank in Israel, all of them in the same kind of frame, and certainly in South Africa, for example. So Johnny Farragher, my former colleague, said that this kind of comparative paradigm is the best insurance against parochialism and its ideological twin, exceptionalism. So agree with that. Second, they don't think that all history leads teleologically to the nation state, right? And that, obviously, there we share a lot of interpretive ground. But there are ways in which I disagree with the settler colonial approach. But I think to understand that, one has to take seriously what they're suggesting. So settler colonialism focuses on a double dynamic. The relationship between settlers and indigenous people on the one hand, and the relationship of settlers, or settlers, colonists, whatever you want them, and their imperial overlords on the other. The short answer is settlers hate both groups, right? Equally and passionately, right? They hate their imperial overlords and they hate indigenous people, and they try to do everything they can to get out of the grasp of the imperial overlords and to seize land from indigenous people. Right? The goal of settlers is to replace indigenous people and to take their land. So Patrick Wolfe, who is the sort of ideological, most sophisticated scholar who's written about settler colonialism, said, settler colonization is a winner-take-all project whose dominant feature is not exploitation, but replacement. Now, I want to highlight a couple of advantages of our approach. First, the settler colonialism model excludes India, which is a problem for thinking about the British Empire, right? There's no substantial settler population as distinct from the state or company bureaucrats in the military. And the problem here is, you might just say, oh, well, settler colonialism is just, India is just an exception. But by making India an exception in the British Empire is reproducing the same effect of Sir John Seeley's racially charged distinction between true colonies of the British Empire and India using a different language. And so I don't think any theory of colonization which excludes India is worth endorsing. My first point. Second, settler colonialism minimizes the role of the imperial state. When it comes to the state, colonialism and settler colonialism operate differently. The state is paramount in the former and is minimal in the latter. In other words, in a settler colonial paradigm, there is no state activity. While settler colonies often insert sovereign claims on behalf of the empire, the real content of their claims, however, was local territorial control over the process of indigenous dispossession. In other words, the imperial state was not part of the process at all. What distinguished 20th century colonialism from earlier instantiations was precisely that settlers in these later cases remained politically and in the last instance militarily subjected to and dependent on the metropole. In other words, say Elkins and Peterson, earlier settler colonialism had no such ties to the imperial state. So only in the 20th century do settlers realize that the imperial state can help them. They're really not terribly clever people in their view. Right, so, but the settler colonialism paradigm thus absolutely reproduces the views of Neil Ferguson of the imperial state, right? There's no daylight between them. There was no imperial state. And part of what I've been trying to suggest to you was actually there was an incredibly powerful imperial state, and in many of the cases of indigenous dispossession, which actually many of these people write about, the state was deeply involved and implicated in a variety of ways. Third, settler colonialism has a too constricted view of political economy, or to put it otherwise, a too simple view of political economy, right? This is Patrick Wolf, the primary object of settler colonization is the land itself rather than the surplus value to be derived from mixing labor with it. And here you can obviously see the commentary on Marx, which is implicit here. So the object is the land. So land, not labor, land, not labor is the only basis of wealth. They focus exclusively on production, colonial production, whereas empires in actuality sometimes focused on colonial consumption, right? So if you're focusing on consumption, then labor is going to be absolutely central. So it's taking a very complex set of arguments and simplifying it and just cherry picking one of the points of view. So, fourth, settler colonialism homogenizes attitudes of both empires and indigenous peoples. The approach strips out the politics for both indigenous peoples and empires, right? Farragher points to peaceful relations between New Sweden and the Lenape Indians and peaceful relations between French Acadians and the Micmacs. But in other words, settlers don't always seize land, right? So if they don't always seize land, we need to be asking questions about why do settlers act one way in some circumstances and another way in different circumstances. In other words, it asks one not to homogenize, it calls upon us, but to think much more carefully about what these arguments were. And I'm suggesting to you that some of this had to do with the ideological struggle between these two different political economic visions of empire. So just as the path-breaking Australian historian Henry Reynolds has insisted there was no single mode of black behavior in Australia, right, that there was always diversity, contradiction, competing objectives, that Aborigines behaved politically even in the most unpromising and challenging circumstances, so we need to pay attention to the tensions, contradictions, and politics of imperial actors and their interactions. And Reynolds, I mean, it's not clear from this, but Reynolds does that in his scholarship, whereas people who write about the North American situation, like Pekka Hämäläinen, don't. And I think that that's deeply problematic. That in other words, the same logic is to inject politics into both settlers and indigenous peoples and to chart their interactions, which is the only way to get at the specific local outcomes that we get in various different places. So what? Why should we care about all that I've been wittering on about for however long I've been wittering? Well, I'm going to give you one example and three implications. The example is the Boston Tea Party, which should be familiar to everybody in the room, right? So that's normally known as the sort of great heroic moment in our national history, right? The nasty British were trying to trick the American colonists into paying, into paying taxes on tea. So a bunch of guys dressed up in Indian dress and threw things into Boston Harbor, which must be why Boston Harbor smells so great today. Right, that's the normal story. But in fact, the colonials the American colonials knew quite a lot about what was going on in India. They knew about the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1771. Now, the Bengal famine between 1769 and 1771 is no minor global historical event. 3 million people died in the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1771. Now, a prize for anybody who knows, what was the population of British North America in 1770? Yeah, well, it was 3 million if you count the enslaved population, right? So this was a big deal that a huge number of people. And Ezra Stiles, the minister in Newport, Rhode Island, and of course the future president of Yale College, said in 1776 that would the East India Company content themselves with the commerce they might endure, but grasping at power and internal dominion in India will prove the ruin of the company and the commerce at a time when perhaps Providence may make it, they're not referring to Providence, Rhode Island, but Providence, may make it for the best, both for Great Britain and America, they should cease. By 1773, Americans were familiar from the London prints of the East India Company's acts of unheard of inhumanity, which led to the famine itself. So the two most important American publications, I guess you can sort of read them. One is The Alarm. And they were worried, John Dickinson, the American patriot, said, we're very worried that what was happening in Bengal was about to happen in North America. This was the concern about the Tea Act, right? The East India Company's conduct in Asia, he said, for some years past has given ample proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. They have levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes, and sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenues of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers, and these not being sufficient to glut their avarice, they have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their properties and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500,000, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year. Okay, just in case that wasn't enough, the Alarm said, wonder not then that the power obtained by bribery and corruption at the expense of the national commerce should be used to the most tyrannical and cruel purposes. It is shocking to humanity to relate the relentless barbarity practiced by the servants of that body on the helpless Asiatics, a barbarity scarce equaled even by the most cruel savages or Cortez, the Mexican conqueror. Taught by the monopoly of trade, they had wickedly acquired with impunity from their countrymen. They were lost to all the feelings of humanity and monopolized the absolute necessaries of life in India at a time of apprehended scarcity. Thousands perished by this black, sordid, and cruel avarice. So the worry by these North American commentators was that the East India Company was going to do unto North America what they had already done unto India. So the point here is that by seeing this as a local event and a binary relationship between North America and Britain, they missed the fact that North Americans interpreted British actions in terms of a global empire, right? That's my point. Okay, so why think the empire whole? First, because the empire the British Empire is a structural phenomenon. Imperial structures explain patterns of development, military victories and defeats, and the growth of slavery, right? No slavery in the British Empire without state support for British Empire, for slavery. Second, the British Empire was administered globally. Repertoires of empire were debated on a global scale. Experiences in one place were applied to others, as the example of the Tea Act just showed. Third, the British Empire was experienced globally. Intentionally or unintentionally, the structures and actions of the British Empire, shaped by a hotly contested imperial politics, interacted with indigenous polities and peoples. Taking the imperial out of the equation in favor of settlers, i.e. the settler colonial approach, misses, I think, a great deal. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to start the Q&A, and I know it's a little bit strange, but this mic does not amplify, but we do have a YouTube video being filmed, so just to hear your questions, I'm going to pass around a mic. I'm going to take prerogative, though, to ask a somewhat facetious question here. So in 2006, the Canadian House of Commons recognized Quebec as a nation within a nation, or the Quebecois. So can we speak about the Canadian Empire? What do you think?
Yeah. No. I mean, look. Yes. I mean, the answer is yes. I mean, so let me take a step back. In fact, I was just talking with Jeremy Weber, who's the former dean of the law school at UVic, University of Victoria, about this. So confederations. Let me take a step back. Imperial states. One of the repertoires of imperial state governance was to adopt confederations. And in fact, the preferred model of the patriots was confederal empire. And that's what Canada is, a confederation, right? So, I think one should also talk about the United States as an empire, not because of, all of the sort of things, bad things or good things or whatever things that America did overseas, but because it's a confederation, it's an empire. So yes, I think one can speak of Canada as an empire in the same way. I mean, I think one can speak of Australia as an empire as well. I mean, I think this sort of robust discussion between Australia and Canada about federation and federationism is really a discussion about the nature of their empire.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for a really fantastic talk, and I am thinking of so many things, but specifically if we stick into the 18th century and thinking about, as you talk about this growth of an imperial globalized identity and the growth of an imperial state, I also wonder about, and we briefly talked about this earlier when you met some grad students, about this idea of these growths of definitions of subjecthood, or some people call it imperial citizenship. And I mean, there's this whole literature, right, like Hannah Weiss-Muller and others are bringing this up, but also to our conversation earlier, this trans-imperial debate with people like Josep Fredera talking about the imperial nation. And I'm just curious because I really think it is, for one, like you say, this teleology of like, well, empires don't have citizens. People escape from empires to become citizens of republics, and that's just, we know that's wrong. But also the various global imperial definitions of what it means to be a British subject in the 18th century that almost invariably come into real conflict with what the British state thinks a British subject should be or an imperial subject should be. So just sort of, how do you think we should talk about that more and use those terminologies and really get into that deep ideology of subjecthood as it existed in that time?
Yeah, I mean, so let me say, because I've told you how ironic I'm going to be, I'm not going to directly criticize Hannah Weiss-Muller's book. But yes, so I think, but I think the conflict takes place, is a political conflict, not a structural conflict. That these different definitions of British citizenship or British subjecthood are deeply political, and I can give you some examples. So I'll give you a perhaps less well-known example, right? Britain, or England, got control of Bombay with the marriage of Catherine of Braganza in 1661, and they developed Bombay as a port, actually as an imperial free port, right? In Bombay, the free port guys, led by the first two governors, George Oxenden and Gerald Angier, created a General Assembly in Bombay. Now, the General Assembly in Bombay, different from what you would expect in North America, didn't just enfranchise or include white men. It included Muslims, Parsis, Hindus, no women as far as I know, but the General Assembly, and this continued until a different governor by the name of John Child came to Bombay, and he said, no, we can't have an assembly with only white English people who have taken the oath of supremacy could possibly be a member of the assembly. Now, so there are different definitions, but they were actually tied very tightly to different political economies, right? So Angier wanted Bombay to be a free port, right? And a free port meant, what is a free port? A free port has two things, right? A free port has lower customs rate than the areas around it, so to attract commerce, and it invites merchants from different countries to settle in the free port. Those are the two minimal definitions of what a free port is. They wanted to do that. So you could see attracting foreign merchants to settle there, giving them the right to participate, vote, and to participate in the assembly is going to be a major thing. So that was his model, so he went to this sort of General Assembly. Child thought that no, Bombay is not going to be a free port. The only possible value of Bombay was as a naval base and possibly a center to attack and seize the Golconda diamond mines, right? I mean, pie in the sky plan, but nevertheless, that was the vision, right? And of course, in that model, you don't need to attract foreign merchants. So he restricted, and in fact, I mean, he restricted subjecthood radically, right? So, I mean, the point here is that yes, the notion of what it meant to be a British subject was contested during the period, but I think if you add politics to it, that you begin to see these contests as less local conflicts and as more part of a grand imperial strategy, which is also, I think, tied to different visions for what the political economy of the provinces are going to be. And I could repeat the same story with telling with Halifax or Tangier, et cetera, et cetera.
Really enjoyed the talk, thank you. When you were talking about the neutrality of empire, I lived in Belfast for a while, and there was a lot of redevelopment there, and that encouraged a lot, especially Republicans, because it cut off the Falls Road. They were thinking that it was a devious British trick. Then I thought about Reichardt's map.
Yeah.
And interacting with the Indian routes. So is that more partition, like with Palestine, Northern Ireland, North America in the 18th century? Is that an example of neutrality?
Yeah, so when I said neutrality, I wasn't referring to the empire, the imperial state being neutral. I was referring to the definition. So, I mean, my point is that scholars have either written about empire as things to be celebrated or denigrated. They haven't defined empire analytically. So my point is not that the imperial states themselves are neutral, but that we, as scholars thinking about imperial states and defining what is an imperial state and what isn't an imperial state, need to have an ideologically neutral definition. So I mean, my point is that yes, I mean the argument, I mean the argument, the actions of the empire, and this goes back to the earlier question about definition of British subjecthood. The British imperial state is called upon to act on behalf of whoever the proper British subjects are. But if you're disagreeing about who the different British subjects are, the infrastructural projects that one's going to have are going to look very differently. So in the case of Alec's map for North America, British subjects included people who were living within the populations in the 13 colonies, and they were willing, I mean, if you notice on that map, they don't cut across Haudenosaunee paths, right? Because they're in alliance, but they cut off the connections between all these other groups, right? So that's a definition of British British subjecthood. And I know nothing about the 20th century. I've heard a rumor that it occurred before this century, but I know very little about it. But my suspicion about what you say about Belfast is exactly who counts, right? Republicans don't count.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. So I have a question about infrastructure. Why is it that the British spend so much on colonial infrastructure and the Spanish and the French don't? And you talked about Reichard, but where are the plans for the infrastructure coming from? What models are they looking at?
Yeah. Okay. So let me. I mean, we have experts on the Spanish Empire we can talk about. I mean, I'm about to in 2 or 3 days have a discussion with Alejandro Irigoyen from the LSE about Spanish colonial infrastructure. But so the French case is easier to explain, right? The French colonies are administered out of La Marine, the Navy, right? Vincennes, if any of you have been to the archives at Vincennes, it's a total trip. But what that meant was that the French state spent a lot of money on colonial infrastructure, and they did when France was not at war. The second that France was at war, all of the money that might have gone to the colonies went to the Navy, right? It was just sucked up by the Navy. So during wartime, and the reason why Alex is able to show this is that during wartime, the French spend not a sou on infrastructural development, right? Now, the issue in colonial Spanish America is somewhat different. So basically what ends up happening is the focus, one way to think about it is that the focus is on getting silver from Spanish America to Spain. And so there are infrastructural plans which go along those lines. But the other thing that's important is the relative autonomy of the audiencias in a variety of ways in doing various things. So there's less of a sort of coordinated plan, and I think part of what the Bourbon reforms are about is precisely to get that sort of coordination later. And there's reason to believe, there's reason. Pombal says, when referring to Portuguese infrastructural reforms, Pombal says, quite explicitly, we just need to organize things the way the British do, more centralized organization. It hates the British, right? Pombal is a sort of weird combination of Anglophobe and Anglophile. But he admires the British but wants to undo what they've done. But he says, he makes exactly this comment with respect to the Portuguese Empire. So I hope that's answered your question to some degree.
Yes, Steve in the back. Great talk as ever. Just want to see if you could describe, if I understand right. So if the United States is an empire, technically not. So you have the American Revolution is a sort of breakaway from the British Empire, and then on Pincushian terms, there's the formation of a new kind of empire. That's the United States, and then if you follow that through the 19th century, there's a real stress, put it that way, on the United States empire in like the 1850s and 60s. This failed. So I guess the question is, not morally but analytically, what distinguished that stress in the 1850s and 60s from the stress of the 1760s and 70s and early 80s? What was going on, I guess what I'm asking, in the American Revolution that wasn't going on analytically in the Civil War?
Right. I think that's a great question, Robert. So the difference is the arguments of the Americans in the 1770s and 1780s are not that the argument is essentially that Britain has violated its own constitution. Right. So, to sort of repeat a story that I tell in my book, The Heart of the Declaration, right? George Washington, when he's reviewing the troops that are going to be completely useless in resisting the British in Manhattan, he reviews the troops when he receives the Declaration of Independence. He waves it in front of the British troops, and he says, "See, we're fighting to protect the British Constitution." Right? That's what they thought they were doing. So their view is that what George III had done by not providing, George III puts a stop to investments in infrastructure. He doesn't give Quebec an assembly. He does, there are all sorts of things, right, that he does that they say are violating the British Constitution. They're fighting to protect the British Constitution. Quite literally. And Hamilton says this. One way of reading some of Hamilton's contribution to the Federalist is along those lines, if you read it along with some of his earlier political economic pamphlets, as well as the stuff that everybody reads on manufacturing, et cetera. So their argument is that they're protecting the British Constitution, and their argument is the problem with the British Empire is not constitutional, right? It's not constitutional. It's that we have these corrupt politicians who are violating the Constitution. My understanding, I mean, I'm no American historian, but my understanding is that the argument that was advanced by the southern states was an argument about enforcing the Constitution, right? I mean, so their arguments, are about the ability of states to determine central questions on slavery, right? I mean, basically, right? And so their argument is that that individual states get to decide what their position on slavery was. Their argument is not so much that, it's less of an argument, I think, about the Constitution. So the end, right, if the American patriots got what they wanted, Lord North's government would have fallen, the relationship with Britain would have been restored to normal, and America would have stayed in the empire, right? And there's a certain sense in which, recent work on the Treaty of Paris suggests that there's echoes on this, that the Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolutionary War was much less the American triumph that people say it was, but it actually created intentionally a kind of economic dependency on Britain, and it was an attempt to sort of reimagine the British Empire in even more confederal terms, right? I don't think those who withdrew, Calhoun, et cetera, I think they didn't think things could ever be hunky-dory again, right? I think one is a sort of reformist agenda on the part of the patriots which failed, right? And that leads to fighting. One is an attempt to say, no, we're so fundamental, we have such fundamentally different political economies, we need to be separate.
I'm going to ask a question, Steve. Thanks for the talk.
Oh, what about your wife?
Oh, sorry. So my question is about another interpretation of the British Empire that's kind of gotten a lot of mileage recently, and that is that really emphasizes the agency and role of private companies or chartered companies inside the mechanisms of the empire, particularly in India. And this is, of course, though you want a unified field theory of the empire, you do have this problem, and that is that the Indian Empire was the creation of a private company. And when the Americans are condemning the East India Company, and when Burke is making his speeches about birds of prey in passage for an appetite constantly wanting, for resources that are constantly wasting, and so forth, he's talking about private actors and actors that are corrupt because they are private and are kind of usurping governmental powers, in a sense, or ruling powers. So I know your answer because I've asked this question to you before, but for the sake of the room, how would you kind of reconcile your interpretation of the British Empire with Phil Stern and other people who've made this?
I don't know if this is so ironic or reconciliatory.
Go ahead, blast away.
Right. So, look, let me answer. There's two levels. There's a theoretical answer and an empirical answer. The empirical answer is that story is just wrong, right? The East India Company was never sovereign in India, right? The East India Company existed because there was a charter given by the crown. The East India Company, it was sort of offloading some resources just the way that this happens all the time, but they weren't sovereign. So, for example, to give you a couple of examples, Bombay mints coins, right? They mint coins in Bombay. The East India Company doesn't do it on its own. They write to Charles II for the right to mint coins, right? So to give you another example, the East India Company in the 1670s and 1680s decides it wants to shut down private traders, so-called interlopers, which what they are is subject to debate, but they want to shut them down. Does the East India Company say, well, we have the sovereign authority, we'll shut them down, they're trading in South Asia? No, they say, the only way we can do this is for the king to outlaw them and for us to get a ruling in King's Bench, not East India Company bench, but King's Bench, to outlaw this, and then they round them up, right? And when there's a rebellion in Bombay, so-called Kegwin's Rebellion, against what was going on, this turn away from the free port in Bombay. The East India Company doesn't say, okay, we're going to send our ships to put this down. No, they call for a Royal Navy commander to sail to Bombay to put this down. So there's no sovereignty, right? Now that said, obviously this indicates that sovereignty is messy, and that much is right. But it's not messy in the sense that there's that there's completely sovereign entities. It's just that there is no indivisible sovereignty in England, or at least in the 17th century and the 18th century. I should also say that if one looks, especially in the period that Burke is writing about, in the 18th century, so from 1718 onwards, the East India Company ceases having elections, meaningful elections for its directors. The elections, look slightly fishy. So up until 1718, 1719, they have elections, and one guy gets 50 votes, another guy gets 72 votes, and they tally it, and whoever gets the most votes wins. After 1718, the elections are 100-0 on each count, right? So something's happening, and these people just happen to be the people that the then sitting prime minister has nominated, right? So the separation between the company as an autonomous private enterprise and the state seems to be very, very thin, or as my son used to say, very thin. So I don't think they're separate things. The other thing I want to say is that the whole theory is confused because Stern and others, assumes that everyone in Europe has a notion of indefeasible, of united sovereignty where there's no appeal against the sovereign. Now, if everybody in Europe had this from time out of mind, because he starts the story in the 16th century, it makes Hobbes's originality seem somewhat less, or Baudin's originality. Why do we read Baudin and Hobbes if everybody already knew what, and I think the point is that was a contested point of view, right? And that if really one wants to understand differences of sovereignty, different notions of sovereignty, which I think are important because I think it is messy, one needs to recover the politics of these differences and to really trace out the ideological differences, not just assume that all sovereignty is necessarily indivisible the way that they do. I'm not saying that nobody thought that, I'm just saying that not everybody did, and their argument, his argument assumes that everybody did.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for this. This is really interesting, and my mind went sort of in a comparative direction. I was thinking of another global empire, which was the Ottomans, and this is back a long time ago, but when I was studying the Ottoman Empire, we definitely studied it as the word empire as an analytical category. There's a very careful distinction made between nation and the Ottomans considered themselves as Ottomans, right? The Janissary system made sure that people cycled through the elites from all over the empire, and it was. So I guess my question is, what is it about the scholarship of the British Empire that impedes this kind of historiographical thinking? Because in a way, this was all very familiar to me when thinking about the scholarship in the Ottoman context.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's certainly true, right? Obviously Karen Harvey, Karen Barkey, who I cited, is an Ottoman sociologist. A sociologist of the Ottoman Empire. She's also Turkish. I think the problem is that in the Ottoman case, the empire is no longer so ideologically charged, right? So you have, politics in Turkey right now is ugly and awful, right? But the division between the Erdoganians and the whatever you want to call them, more pro-Republicans, is not about, neither side wants to recover the empire, right? They're about other issues. So it's capable of historical analysis in a certain sort of way. Whereas I think in Britain, the empire is still a live issue in a variety of ways. I mean, it's not like if you look at Rishi Sunak's speeches, you're going to see long disquisitions on the empire. Although I will tell you that on Michael Gove's homepage, there is a long disquisition about the empire. But let's just assume that he's an outlier. But it is a sense in which there is this. I mean, there's a notion. I mean, so the debate. I mean, let me just sort of put it this way. The debate about Brexit was a very sophisticated, multi-pronged debate, right? We all know, Richard Tuck wrote, a left case for Brexit, that there are people along the ideological spectrum who took different positions. But I think it's fair to say that for a number of people, the EU in the political imaginary was an alternative to the lost empire. I mean, that is to say, there was a kind of notion, a sequential notion. Decolonization happened, and then we went into the EU. For some people, that was a good thing. For some people, that was a bad thing. But the point is that from both I don't want to call them left and right, but pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit people, there was that particular issue was an issue which was deeply embedded with debates about the empire from both sides. I mean, from both sides because of that kind of sequencing. So I think it's an emotional issue with respect to the British Empire in a very kind of significant way. And I think that makes it very hard for people to write about it analytically.
Time for last question.
Maybe a too specific question to end on, but I was just wondering, thank you so much, Steve, super interesting. What happens at the end of your period with the Patriot ideology and the Whig establishment, the two political economies competing? So you mentioned the Treaty of Paris, Shelburne, the architect of that from the British side, follower William Pitt the Elder, and then subsequently the rise of William Pitt the Younger. So what type of vision of empire did Pitt the Younger represent in the last few decades of the 18th century?
Yeah, I mean, let me give you a big picture answer and then specifically answer your question. The big picture answer is that this debate over different political economies of empire persists into the 19th and into the 20th century. I think you can, and so, for example, I mean, just to give you some examples and then get to your specific question, I think it's important to realize that one of the visions for Sydney, for Singapore, for Hong Kong, were continuing this kind of consumption-based, capturing markets model of empire, right? The idea was that Sydney would help Britain capture the Chinese market, right? I mean, obviously, Hong Kong was explicitly about that, but that was, right? And so, there was another vision for Australia, right? That it would be an agrarian, some kind of agrarian paradise where they would give all these, former convicts these little tiny plots, and all they would do was grow whatever it is they would grow, and there would be no commerce, right? And so there was those people of those vision were absolutely livid that, funnily these convicts tended to gravitate to this city, Sydney, right? And that was perceived to be a really bad, failure of the New South Wales project. But this continues; these debates continue into the 19th and 20th century about what the empire is about, and even at moments of decolonization, I think. But we can talk about that. But yes, so my view is that William Pitt the Younger, basically between after the fall of Shelburne, or after the failure of Fox's government in 1784, he gradually moves towards exactly the position that his father opposed. William Pitt the Younger, so it's a complicated story, and I'm not, I mean, I see Pitt's India Act establishing a border of control, focusing on extraction, is very much a continuation not of his father's policies, but of his uncle's policies, George Grenville's policies. And I think he goes farther in that direction. Now, would I be comfortable in announcing that Pitt himself went through that ideological transformation? No. But what I would be, because I think it's, I mean, he created a cabinet, he worked with a lot of other people. He was also trying to, trying to maintain a majority in Parliament, which meant that he made various ideological concessions along the way. But my basic view is that Pitt took his party in that direction, right? And that's where I think Fox becomes, as an opposition figure, becomes full-throated in defending what he sees as Pitt's father's, William Pitt the Younger's father's position. And he did come up through politics as a Pittite, right? I mean, and I think it's extremely important. And he also saw, I mean, Fox is, unequivocal that Shelburne betrayed Pitt's legacy. And I mean, so this is, that's the kind of position that I think. And I think, I mean, there's a longer argument about abolitionism because I think there's two different versions of abolition. Fox's version of abolition involved, I mean, they all agreed about abolishing slavery, right? But Fox's version of abolition also involved remaking the former slave societies into something else with consumers, right? And so he was very concerned about all of these laws being passed in places like Jamaica, restricting free blacks from selling goods. He didn't like that. He wanted to get rid of that. And he wanted to make Jamaica into a free port and to empower the free blacks and mulattoes in Jamaica to do a lot more. Whereas Pitt's version of abolition was just get rid of slavery. Get rid of slavery, keep all of these other things intact so that the planters won't be destroyed. Right? I mean, so his idea is that if you keep all of these other restrictions, the planters, they won't be slaves anymore, but they'll be working on the plantations for wages.
Thank you, Professor Stephen Pincus, and I would like to just have everyone give him a round of applause for such a great event tonight.